What did you find out that made you see red? The call came at 5:17 p.m. on a Thursday. My daughter Lily had been unresponsive in the water. Staff had pulled her out. Paramedics were already there. By the time I reached the Harmon Aquatic Center, other parents were standing in the parking lot in silence. Their children were wrapped in towels. Mine was on a stretcher. A woman in a staff jacket met me at the entrance and told me Lily had been participating in time trials. She said there were 4 trained staff members on deck. She said everything had been done correctly. She said it before I had formed a single question. Lily was 8 weeks from her 10th birthday. She had been swimming competitively since she was 6. Her coach at the YMCA had told me 2 months earlier that she had real potential. At the hospital, the attending physician told me Lily did not survive. She said the term was dry drowning complications. She said it can happen even to strong swimmers. She said sometimes by the time anyone sees it, it is already too late. I asked how long Lily had been in distress before someone acted. The doctor said she didn't have that information. The facility director, a man named Patrick Soren, called me the following morning. He said the center was devastated. He said Lily had been a joy to coach. He said the staff on deck had responded the moment they noticed anything wrong. I asked him to define the moment. He said pools were dynamic environments. He offered to cover all associated costs. I drove to the center 3 days later. Through the front window, I could see the pool was in use. Staff were on deck. One was on his phone. One was talking to a parent near the bleachers. I photographed both through the glass and left without going in. I submitted a public records request to the County Aquatics Licensing Board. The center had received no violations in 4 years. I called 4 other parents whose children train there regularly. 2 of them told me their kids had complained about staff being inattentive during sessions. One told me her son had gotten a cut on his chin from the pool ladder 2 months earlier, and the center had told her he bumped it on the lane divider. She had not pushed it further. 6 weeks after Lily died, the medical examiner's final report reached me. Lily had water in her lungs consistent with drowning. She also had bruising along her left temple that the examiner noted was inconsistent with any pool surface contact. He described it as blunt impact occurring prior to submersion. I read that paragraph 4 times standing in my kitchen. I called Soren and read him those exact words. There was a long silence. Then he said that physical contact between swimmers during competitive drills was common. He said Lily had probably been accidentally struck by another child mid-lap. I asked whether the deck cameras had captured the session. He said the cameras covered the lobby and the exterior entrance for liability purposes. I asked why not the pool itself. He said it was a member privacy policy. 10 weeks after Lily died, a woman named Deb Castor sent me a direct message through the Swim League's parent forum. She had worked at Harmon Aquatics for 2 years before leaving the previous spring. She asked if we could meet somewhere quiet. We sat in a booth at a diner off the highway. She kept her voice low. She told me Soren ran the center on the smallest possible staff budget. She said 2 of the 4 deck staff the day Lily died had been formally reported by parents for inattention in the previous 18 months. She said Soren had buried both complaints to protect the center's league standing. She said one staff member, a man named Garrett, had been observed grabbing a child by the arm and yanking him from the pool during a dispute over lane placement. Soren had told the child's parents the staff member was simply helping the boy exit safely. Garrett had been on deck the afternoon Lily died. Then she slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were printed copies of internal incident reports that had never been submitted to the licensing board, 5 separate events across 2 years involving injuries, near misses, and 1 prior submersion that had been logged internally as a minor medical incident. I went to the police the next morning and brought everything. The detective I spoke with was named Miller. He looked at the medical examiner's report and then at the papers Deb had given me. He didn't promise anything. He told me that negligence is a hard hill to climb in a criminal court unless there's proof of a conscious disregard for life. He said accidents happen in sports. I told him a 9-year-old girl with a bruise on her temple doesn't just stop breathing in a pool with 4 lifeguards unless someone is lying. He told me he'd look into it. 2 weeks went by. The silence in my house was heavy. I kept Lily's swim bag in the hallway because I couldn't bring myself to move it. It still smelled like chlorine and Hawaiian tropic sunscreen. Every time I walked past it, I felt a physical ache in my chest. Then Deb called me again. She sounded scared. She told me that Soren had found out she'd been talking to people. He had sent her a cease and desist letter from a high-end law firm in the city. He was threatening to sue her for defamation and breach of a non-disclosure agreement she'd signed when she left. I can't testify, she whispered. I have 2 kids, Mike. I can't lose my house because of a legal battle I can't afford. That was the moment I realized the police weren't going to move fast enough. Soren was scrubbing the trail. He was a man who viewed a child's life as a line item on an insurance policy. I went back to the Harmon Aquatic Center. I didn't go in the front. I sat in my car in the back of the lot where the staff parked. I waited until 6 p.m. when the shift changed. I saw Garrett walk out. He was in his early 20s, wearing a hoodie and carrying a gym bag. He looked like any other college kid. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like someone who didn't care. I followed him to a nearby bar. He met a couple of guys, had 3 beers, and laughed a lot. I sat in a booth in the corner, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. I watched him. He was animated, acting out a story with his hands. At one point, he mimicked a swimming stroke and then made a sinking motion with his hand, laughing as his friends joined in. I felt the blood rush to my face. I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from getting up and hitting him. I waited until he went to the bathroom. I followed him in. The place was empty, except for us. He was at the urinal, humming to himself. I stood at the sink and washed my hands. I looked at him in the mirror. Garrett, I said. He jumped a little, looking over his shoulder. Yeah? Do I know you? I'm Lily's father. The color drained from his face instantly. He didn't try to play it cool. He looked like he was about to vomit. He tried to push past me toward the door, but I stepped in his way. I'm not a big guy, but I had nothing to lose, and he could see that in my eyes. I know about the reports, Garrett, I said, my voice shaking. I know Soren has been covering for you. I know you were on your phone when she went under, and I know about the bruise on her head. It was an accident, he stammered, his voice cracking. She was being difficult. She wouldn't get out of the lane for the older kids' heat. I tried to move her. She slipped. She hit her head on the starting block before she went in. I thought she was just being dramatic, staying under. I didn't think. You watched her hit her head I said. You watched her go under, and you didn't jump in? I panicked, he whispered. I knew I wasn't supposed to touch the kids. Soren told us. He told us if anything happened, we had to say she just stopped swimming. He said the insurance wouldn't cover a physical altercation. He said he'd fire me and make sure I never worked in this town again. Where's the footage, Garrett? He has it, Garrett said, tears starting to track down his face. He didn't delete it. He keeps it on a private server in his office. He uses it to keep us quiet. He told us if we ever talked, he'd show the board the footage of us being on our phones or not following protocol. He's got us all trapped. I let him go. He scrambled out of the bathroom and out of the bar. I knew he wouldn't go to the police. He was too terrified of Soren. But now, I knew where the truth was. I didn't go home. I drove back to the aquatic center. It was 11:30 p.m. The parking lot was empty. The lights were dimmed to the security settings. I knew the layout from the years Lily had spent there. I knew the back door near the chemical storage was often propped open during the day for ventilation, and that the latch was finicky. I had a crowbar in my trunk. I didn't care about being quiet. I didn't care about the alarm. I got to the back door. It was locked, but the frame was old. One hard shove with the crowbar and the wood splintered. The alarm started chirping a localized, high-pitched beep. It wasn't a silent alarm. It was meant to scare off teenagers. I knew I had maybe 5 minutes before a security company or a passing patrol car noticed. I ran to Soren's office. It was locked too. I didn't use the crowbar this time. I kicked the door right next to the handle. It swung open on the second try. The office smelled like stale coffee and expensive leather. I saw the computer on his desk. It was a high-end tower. Next to it was a small black box, a network-attached storage drive. I didn't try to log into the computer. I didn't have time for passwords. I ripped the cables out of the back of the black box and stuffed it under my arm. I heard a car pull into the gravel lot outside. I didn't go back out the way I came. I ran through the locker rooms and out the side emergency exit. The alarm triggered a louder siren as the door opened. I sprinted across the wet grass toward the woods that lined the back of the property. I hid in the brush for 20 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched a private security car roll through the lot. The guard got out, looked at the broken back door, and started talking into his radio. I circled back through the woods to where I'd parked my car 3 blocks away in a residential neighborhood. I drove home with the black box on the passenger seat. I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night at my kitchen table with my laptop. It took me 3 hours to bypass the basic admin password on the drive. It wasn't encrypted. Soren was arrogant, not a tech genius. I found the folder labeled Deck, Cam, Archive. I found the date, May 14th. I sat there for a long time, my hand hovering over the mouse. I knew that once I clicked play, I would see the last moments of my daughter's life. I knew it would destroy me, but I owed it to her. I watched. The quality was grainy but clear. It was 4:52 p.m. Lily was in lane 4. She was finishing a lap. Garrett was standing at the edge of the pool. He was looking at his phone. Lily reached the wall and tried to pull herself up. She was saying something to him. Garrett looked down, looked annoyed, and reached out. He didn't help her. He shoved his foot toward her shoulder to push her back into the water, a get back in and finish gesture, but he misjudged it. His foot caught her in the chest, and as she recoiled, her head slammed into the concrete edge of the starting block. She slipped silently under the surface. Garrett didn't look up from his phone for another 90 seconds. When he finally did, he didn't jump in. He looked around to see if anyone was watching. He walked to the other end of the pool. He waited. He waited until another kid pointed toward the bottom of lane 4. Then and only then did he start the rescue. I saw Soren come onto the deck 5 minutes later. I saw them huddled together while the paramedics worked on Lily in the background. I saw Soren point to the camera. I saw Garrett nod. I didn't cry. I felt a cold, hard clarity that I have never felt before or since. I didn't go to Detective Miller. I knew how the system worked. Files get lost. High-priced lawyers find technicalities in how evidence was gathered. I knew that if I handed this over as a burglar, it might be thrown out as fruit of the poisonous tree. I contacted the local news station, specifically an investigative reporter named Sarah Jenkins, who had done pieces on municipal corruption. I told her I had the footage. I told her I had the internal reports. I told her I had a whistleblower ready to talk if her legal fees were covered. Sarah met me at a coffee shop. She watched the video on her tablet. She turned it off halfway through and put her head in her hands. "We're going to run this," she said. "We're going to run it tonight." The fallout was a landslide. The news segment aired at 6 p.m. on Monday. By 8 p.m., a crowd had gathered outside the Harmon Aquatic Center. By 10 p.m., the county board had suspended Soren's license. The police couldn't ignore it anymore. With the footage being public, the illegal search didn't matter for the sake of public outcry. They executed a real search warrant the next morning. They found the original files, and they found the paper trail of Soren's payoffs to inspectors. Garrett was arrested at his parents' house. He folded in the interrogation room in under 20 minutes. He told them everything: how Soren had coached them on what to say, how he'd threatened them, how they'd altered the logs. Soren tried to flee. He was picked up at the airport trying to board a flight to Cozumel. The trial took a year. It was grueling. I had to see their faces every day. Soren sat there in his expensive suits, looking like a victim of a witch hunt. Garrett just looked hollow. Soren was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and multiple counts of racketeering related to the facility's operation. He got 12 years. Garrett got 5 for his role in the cover-up and the negligence that led to the death. The Harmon Aquatic Center was demolished 6 months later. The land was bought by a non-profit. They turned it into a memorial park. There's no pool there anymore. There's a playground and a garden. They let Garrett out after 3 years and 8 months. The state calls it early release for good behavior. The Department of Corrections sends an automated email when it happens. It dropped into my inbox at 6:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The subject line was sterile. Offender status update. Just black text on a white background. No context. No apologies. Just a notification that the man who watched my daughter drown was walking out of a medium security facility in Chino. I sat at the kitchen island and stared at the screen until the laptop went to sleep. People tell you that closure is a real thing. They write books about it. Therapists charge $200 an hour to help you find it. But closure is a myth invented for the people who have to live around the grieving, so they don't feel uncomfortable. The trial didn't close anything. Burning Soren's world down didn't bring Lily back. It just just meant I didn't have to share a planet with his arrogance anymore. But Garrett was young. Garrett had his whole life ahead of him. I knew he wouldn't come back to our town. The parole board had stipulations, and his family had moved out of state during the trial to escape the local news vans, but I knew where he went. You don't spend a year building a case against people without learning how to track them. His parents had bought a small ranch house in Henderson, Nevada. 2 weeks after the email, I packed a bag. I didn't tell my ex-wife. We had split up 6 months after the trial ended. The house had just become a museum of the worst day of our lives, and looking at each other only reminded us of who wasn't sitting between us on the couch. I drove 14 hours straight. The desert was hot and entirely indifferent. I rented a cheap motel room off Boulder Highway. I spent 2 days sitting in my car down the street from his parents' house. I wasn't planning to kill him. I didn't bring a gun. I just needed to see what 3 years in a cell does to a man who trades a 9-year-old's life for his summer job. On the third day, the front door opened. It was him. He was thicker now. He had buzzed his hair down to the scalp, and he walked with his shoulders hunched, like he was expecting something heavy to drop on him. He got into a 10-year-old Honda Civic and pulled out of the driveway. I followed him. He drove to a Home Depot. He went into the gardening section. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and work boots. I walked in 2 minutes after him and kept an aisle between us. I watched him load bags of mulch onto a flatbed cart. He was moving slowly, deliberately. I turned the corner and stood at the end of the aisle. He pushed the cart forward, looked up, and stopped. The desert heat was bleeding through the open roll-up doors, smelling like fertilizer and hot asphalt. He didn't drop the handle of the cart. He just froze. The color drained out of his face exactly the way it had in that bar bathroom 4 years ago. He looked older. There were deep, exhausted lines around his mouth. We stood there for a long 10 seconds. "Mr. Davis," he said. His voice was gravelly. It sounded like it hadn't been used much. "Hello, Garrett." He swallowed hard. His knuckles on the cart handle were white. "Are you going to hurt me? If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't have done it in aisle 14 of a hardware store." He nodded slowly. He looked down at the bags of mulch, then back up at me. He looked completely defeated. There was no arrogance left. No college kid invincibility. "I'm working landscaping," he said, and I didn't know why he was telling me that. "My uncle got me a job. I don't. I don't go near pools. I don't go near water. I can't even take a shower without hearing it." "Hearing what?" I asked. He looked at the concrete floor. The splash. The way her head sounded hitting the block. He started to cry. It wasn't loud. Just a quiet, miserable leaking of tears down his sunburned face. He didn't wipe them away. "I have to live with it every day," he whispered. "I know it doesn't matter to you. I know it shouldn't. But I see her every time I close my eyes." I looked at him. I looked at the cheap work boots and the bags of dirt. I thought about the rage that had kept me warm for 4 years. I had fed off it. I had used it to tear down Soren. I had used it to survive the trial, the divorce, the silent holidays. But looking at Garrett now, I didn't feel the red heat. I just felt tired. He was a broken, haunted shell of a person. He was going to carry Lily's ghost with him for the next 50 years. My anger couldn't do anything to him that his own cowardice hadn't already done. "Good," I said. My voice was completely flat. "Make sure you never stop." I turned around and walked out of the store. I didn't look back. I got into my car and started the engine. I drove back to the motel, packed my bag, and got on the highway. I drove back toward the mountains, toward home. I stopped at a diner in Utah around 3 a.m. I ordered black coffee and eggs. The waitress was a woman in her 60s who called me Han and kept my mug full. I realized, sitting in that booth, that I hadn't brought Lily's swim bag with me on the trip. For the first time since she died, I had left the house without feeling the physical need to know exactly where it was. The grief doesn't shrink. It never shrinks. But you grow around it. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are. Garrett was in his prison, and Soren was in his. I was still in mine, but the doors were finally unlocked. I finished my coffee, left a 20 on the table, and drove the rest of the way home. 7 months after I got back from Nevada, the phone rang on a Sunday morning. It wasn't the Department of Corrections this time. It was Sarah Jenkins, the reporter. We had kept in touch. Not as friends exactly, but as two people bound by a specific, ugly chapter of local history. She told me I shouldn't go down to the park. She said the city was already sending a crew. I didn't ask what happened. I just hung up, grabbed my keys, and drove. The Memorial Park was quiet. It was 7:30 a.m. The November air was biting, smelling like dead leaves, and the exhaust from a county bus that had just rolled past. I walked down the paved path to the center garden. The statue of the girl in the swim cap was covered in neon green spray paint. It was jagged, rushed lines, a sloppy, meaningless symbol on her chest, and a crude word sprayed across her face. It wasn't a targeted attack. It was just bored teenagers with a can of Rust-Oleum on a Saturday night. They didn't know who Lily was. They just saw a piece of metal in an empty park. I stood there with my hands in my pockets. I felt the cold wind coming off the street. A year ago, I would have been tearing the neighborhood apart looking for the kids who did it. I would have wanted blood. I would have found a way to ruin them. Instead, I just felt a heavy, hollow exhaustion. I went to the hardware store on 4th Street. I bought 2 gallons of acetone, a set of heavy-duty chemical gloves, and 3 stiff bristled wire brushes. The cashier didn't ask what I was doing. He just rang it up, $34.12. I drove back to the park. The city crew hadn't shown up yet. It was Sunday. Municipal response times were a joke, and I wasn't going to let Lily stand there looking like that for another hour. I put on the thick black gloves. I poured the acetone directly onto a shop rag. The smell was sharp and industrial. It burned the inside of my nose. I started scrubbing. The paint was fresh, but it was stubborn. It clung to the textured bronze of the swim cap. I worked my way down her face. I pressed the wire brush into the metal until my shoulder ached. The neon green dissolved into a toxic-looking sludge that dripped onto the concrete base. I worked for 2 hours. My breath plumed in the cold air. My knuckles were numb underneath the rubber. Around 10 a.m., I heard the scrape of urethane wheels on the pavement behind me. I didn't stop scrubbing. "Hey man, you can't do that." I turned around. It was a kid, maybe 16, baggy jeans, a faded black hoodie, holding a skateboard by the front trucks. He was looking at me, shifting his weight. "Do what?" I asked. "The city's supposed to handle that. If you mess up the metal, they'll fine you." I looked at him, really looked at him. There was a smear of neon green paint on the side of his left sneaker. He noticed me looking at it and tried to step backward, casually hiding his foot behind behind his right leg. You know who this is? I asked. I pointed to the statue with the wire brush. The kid shrugged, looking past me toward the street. Just some dead kid, right? The pool thing. Her name was Lily, I said. She was 9. She liked the color yellow, she hated oatmeal, and she could hold her breath for a minute and 15 seconds. She died exactly where you're standing. The kid stopped shifting. The fake bravado drained out of his posture. He looked at the wet, half-cleaned bronze, then at the dirty, green-soaked rags piled at my feet. I'm cleaning her face, I said, my voice completely level, because she's my daughter, and she didn't do anything to you. The silence stretched. A car drove by on the main road. The wind rattled the bare branches of the oak trees behind us. The kid swallowed hard. He dropped his skateboard onto the grass. He didn't run away. He didn't apologize. He just walked slowly closer, his eyes fixed on the statue. You got another rag? He asked quietly. I didn't say anything. I reached into the plastic bag, pulled out a clean shop towel, and held it out. He took it. He didn't have gloves. He folded the cloth, crouched down near the base of the statue, and started wiping away the green sludge I had brushed off the pedestal. We worked together in complete silence for another hour. The acetone ate at his bare skin, drying out his knuckles until they were white and cracked, but he didn't complain. He scrubbed until the rag was ruined, until the bronze underneath was clean and dull under the gray sky. When we were done, I packed the empty cans and the toxic rags into a garbage bag. The kid stood up, wiping his raw hands on his jeans. I'm sorry, he said. He didn't look at me. He looked at Lily. Don't come back here with paint, I said. I won't. He picked up his board and walked away down the path. I watched him until he turned the corner and disappeared onto the sidewalk. I packed my supplies into the trunk of my car. I sat in the driver's seat and turned the heater on, letting the warm air thaw my hands. The smell of acetone was soaked into my jacket. I looked out the windshield at the park. The statue was clean. The garden was quiet. I put the car in gear and drove home. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel broken. I just felt like a father who had done his job for the day. 9 years and 2 months after the trial, the state sent another letter. It was on thick, cream-colored paper, with the official seal of the Department of Corrections printed in the top left corner. Patrick Sorin was applying for medical parole. He was 68 years old. He had served nearly 8 years of his 12-year sentence. The letter stated he had been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. The prison medical facility wasn't equipped for the palliative care he required. The board was convening on the 14th of the month to decide if he would be allowed to die in a hospice facility on the outside or if he would die in a cell. Victims' families were permitted 5 minutes to speak. I didn't pack a bag this time. I put on a dark suit, filled the gas tank of my truck, and drove 3 hours north to the state penitentiary. It rained the whole way. Not a storm, just a steady gray drizzle that turned the highway into a slick mirror. I listened to the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say. The prison visitor center smelled like bleach and old coffee. I handed over my driver's license, walked through a metal detector, and was escorted down a long cinder block hallway by a guard who never made eye contact. We entered a small room with fluorescent lights that hummed so loudly I could feel the vibration in my teeth. There was a long folding table. 3 members of the parole board sat on one side. There was a single plastic chair for me on the other. A door on the far wall opened, and a guard wheeled Sorin in. I almost didn't recognize him. The man who had sat in the courtroom 9 years ago was completely gone. The expensive haircuts and custom suits were replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung off him like a flag on a windless day. He was skeletal. His skin had a deep, unhealthy yellow tinge. He had an IV line taped to the back of his hand, connected to a bag hanging from the wheelchair. His eyes were sunken, dark pits in his skull. He looked at me. There was no recognition at first. Then, slowly, he blinked, and he looked down at his lap. The board chairperson, a woman with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, read the medical report into the record. She stated the prognosis, 3 to 6 months. She asked Sorin if he had anything to say. Sorin cleared his throat. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. I have paid for my mistakes, he whispered. His voice was frail, shaking with the effort of speaking. I am a dying man. I just want to see my wife and my grandchildren before the end. I am sorry for the tragedy that occurred under my watch. I pray for that little girl. He was still doing it. He was still calling it a tragedy. He was still distancing himself from the reality of what he had built. The chairperson looked at me. Mr. Davis, you have 5 minutes. I stood up. I didn't look at the board. I looked directly at Sorin. He didn't lift his head. Tragedy is a lightning strike, I said. Tragedy is a car hydroplaning on a wet road. What happened to my daughter was not a tragedy. It was a transaction. Sorin flinched slightly. You ran a facility on a skeletal budget, I continued, my voice steady. The acoustics of the concrete room made every word ring out sharp and loud. You ignored formal complaints. You threatened young staff members into silence. You taught them that covering up liability was more important than pulling a drowning 9-year-old out of the water. You watched the footage of her dying, and your first instinct was to hide the hard drive. I walked around the plastic chair, taking a step closer to the table. The guard shifted his weight, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I don't care about your cancer, I told him. I don't care that you're in pain. I don't care about your wife or your grandchildren. My daughter didn't get to have a family. She didn't get to grow old and get sick. She died terrified, in cold water, with a bruise on her head, while the people you hired stood there and watched. Sorin finally looked up. There were tears in his yellowed eyes. It was real fear. It was the fear of a man standing at the edge of the dark, realizing that all his money and influence couldn't buy him another minute of breath. Please, he rasped. Please, Mike, have mercy. You had 90 seconds to show her mercy, I said. You chose the insurance premium. I turned to the board. He belongs exactly where he is, I said. I didn't wait for them to dismiss me. I walked to the door, knocked once for the guard in the hall, and walked out. I didn't look back to see Sorin's face. I didn't stay to hear the ruling. It didn't matter what they decided. If they let him out, he was going to die. If they kept him in, he was going to die. The power he once held over my life, over the narrative of Lily's death, was entirely broken. He was just a sick, pathetic old man, begging for scraps of time. I walked out of the prison and into the parking lot. The rain had stopped. The sky was breaking open, showing pale strips of blue behind the gray clouds. The air smelled like wet asphalt and pine needles. I got into my truck. I put the key in the ignition, but I didn't turn it. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, For the first time in nearly 10 years, I wasn't carrying the weight of Patrick Soren. I wasn't carrying the anger I had weaponized to survive. The furnace inside my chest, the one that had been burning red hot since that phone call at 5:17 p.m. on a Thursday, finally went out. I felt incredibly light. I felt empty, but it was a clean emptiness. I drove home. I pulled into my driveway as the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. I went inside. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel like a tomb anymore. I walked down the hall to Lily's room. I opened the door. The swim bag was sitting on her desk, exactly where I had left it years ago. I picked it up. The smell of chlorine and sunscreen was mostly gone now, replaced by the faint, dusty scent of an unused room. I walked out to the garage. I found a heavy plastic storage bin, the kind that seals tight against moisture. I folded the swim bag carefully and placed it inside. I closed the lid and snapped the locks into place. I pushed the bin up onto the highest shelf, out of sight. I went back into the kitchen, turned on the light, and made myself dinner. Soren died in late January. The obituary was 4 lines on page 12 of the county paper. It didn't mention Harmon Aquatics. It didn't mention the trial. It said he passed away after a long illness, surrounded by family, and that services would be private. I read it while standing at my kitchen counter, drinking black coffee. I didn't feel a spike of triumph. I didn't feel a sense of justice finally being served. I just folded the newspaper in half, walked out to the garage, and dropped it into the blue recycling bin. 2 weeks later, I called a real estate agent. Her name was Brenda. She walked through my house with a clipboard, her heels clicking loudly on the hardwood floors. She was professional and entirely unsentimental. She told me the roof was in good shape and the location would sell itself, but the interior was too dated. She told me I needed to depersonalize the space. Buyers need to see their own future in the house, she said, not someone else's past. I bought a tape gun, 30 medium-sized cardboard boxes, and a massive roll of bubble wrap. It took me a month to pack up 10 years of silence. I sold the dining room table where Claire and I used to eat before the silence got so loud it pushed us apart. I donated 3 carloads of clothes, books, and old winter coats to a shelter downtown. Then, I had to pack Lily's room. I hadn't changed it since the day she died. The walls were still painted a soft lavender. Her bookshelf was still lined with Percy Jackson novels and horse encyclopedias. Her bed still had the yellow quilt her grandmother had made her. I started with the books. I put them into boxes, taping them shut the moment they were full so I wouldn't have to look at them. I rolled up the posters. I folded the quilt. I worked mechanically, treating it like a job that just had to be finished before the sun went down. When the room was empty, I stood in the doorway. It didn't look like her room anymore. It just looked like a square box of drywall and carpet. The echo had changed. The hardest part wasn't the bedroom. It was the pantry door frame in the kitchen. Starting when Lily was 3, we had marked her height on the inside of the frame with a black Sharpie. There were little horizontal lines trailing up the white wood, each one dated. The highest mark was from 2 months before she died. She had been 4'9". Brenda had told me I needed to paint the trim. She said buyers get turned off by other people's kids' marks. I went to the hardware store and bought a can of eggshell white and a foam roller. I laid down a drop cloth. I stood in front of the door frame for a long time. I traced the highest black line with my thumb. I could almost feel her standing there, pressing her back straight against the wood, telling me not to cheat and push the book down too hard on her head. I opened the can. I dipped the roller into the tray. I started at the bottom. The primer covered the lower marks easily. 3 years old, 4 years old, 5. The white paint rolled over the black ink, erasing the physical proof that she had grown up in this house. My chest felt tight, a sharp physical ache right behind my ribs. My hand was shaking. I stopped at the 6-year mark and had to step back. I leaned over the kitchen island, gripping the granite edge, trying to pull air into my lungs. It felt like I was killing her all over again. It felt like I was wiping her off the earth, but I wasn't. The marks weren't Lily. The house wasn't Lily. The swim bag in the garage wasn't Lily. They were just anchors, keeping me tied to the worst day of my life. I picked up the roller again. I didn't stop this time. I painted over the 7, the 8, the 9. I rolled a heavy coat of eggshell white over the very top line. I stepped back. The door frame was blank. I packed my truck 2 days before closing. The buyers were a young couple from the city. The husband was an architect. The wife was a teacher. She was 6 months pregnant. I had met them briefly during the final walkthrough. They were glowing with that specific, naive excitement of people who think a house is going to solve all their problems. They loved the backyard. They talked about putting a swing set under the oak tree. I didn't tell them what happened to the family that lived here before. It wasn't their burden to carry. On a Tuesday morning, I sat in a title company office and signed my name 24 times. I slid the keys across the polished mahogany table. The husband shook my hand and thanked me. I walked out to my truck. It was packed tight. Everything I owned fit into the bed and the passenger seat. The plastic bin with Lily's swim bag was wedged securely behind my seat. I put the key in the ignition. I drove out of the parking lot and got on the highway heading west. I didn't have a destination, not a specific one. I had rented a small cabin up the coast in Oregon for 3 months. After that, I didn't know. For the first time in a decade, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a target. I had no one to hunt, no one to ruin, and nowhere I had to be. The city limits disappeared in the rearview mirror. The highway opened up, cutting through green hills and wide open farmland. I rolled the window down. The air was cold and moving fast. I turned the radio on. I didn't recognize the song, but I let it play. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, watching the white lines blur past, driving away from the ghost of my daughter, and finally, into whatever was left of my life. The cabin was in a town called Yachats, right on the edge of the Oregon coast. It wasn't a vacation town. It was a place where people worked hard in the rain, drank cheap beer, and didn't ask questions about out-of-state license plates. My rental was a mile off Highway 101, up a steep, rutted dirt road. It had a wood stove, a leaky copper roof, and a view of the Pacific through a stand of Sitka spruce. For the first 3 weeks, I didn't speak to another human being. I woke up at 5 a.m. every day. I made coffee. I chopped wood. I sat on the covered porch and watched the ocean batter the basalt cliffs. The Pacific isn't like a pool. It's not contained. It's violent, dark, and entirely indifferent to whether you live or die. Watching it made me feel incredibly small, which was exactly what I needed. But the silence in the cabin eventually got too loud. Without the white noise of the trial, the anger, hunger, or the house to fix up, my brain started spinning its wheels. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was just idling. On a Tuesday in early April, I drove my truck down the mountain and into town. I parked near the marina. The air smelled like low tide, diesel fuel, and fish guts. There was a boat repair yard at the end of the dock with a hand-painted plywood sign zip-tied to a chain-link fence. Cash help wanted. No idiots. I walked through the open gate. The yard was cluttered with boat cradles, coils of thick yellow rope, and empty oil drums. A man in his late 50s was standing under the hull of a dry-docked commercial fishing boat, wearing a respirator and grinding fiberglass. Dust covered him like snow. He shut off the grinder and pulled down the mask. He was missing the top joint of his left thumb. "You buying or looking for work?" he asked. His voice was loud, permanently calibrated to compete with heavy machinery. "Work," I said. "You know how to use a dual-action sander without burning through the gel coat?" "I can learn." He stared at me for a few seconds. He looked at my hands, which were calloused from the yard work and the wood chopping, then at my face. He didn't ask for a resume. He didn't ask my name. 15 an hour, under the table. You mess up a hull, I take it out of your pay. Grab that respirator on the bench. His name was Mac. For the next 2 months, I worked in his yard. It was brutal, monotonous physical labor. We scraped barnacles, sanded hulls, painted anti-fouling compound, and replaced rotting deck boards. Mac wasn't much of a talker. We communicated in nods, grunts, and the occasional string of curses when a rusted bolt sheared off. It was the best therapy I had ever had. By the end of the day, my arms felt like lead, my lungs ached from the chemical smell of resin, and I was too exhausted to dream. Then came the second week of June. A family from Portland brought in a 20-foot recreational bayliner. They had hit a submerged log near the river mouth and cracked the fiberglass near the stern. Mac told me to get the boat tied off at the slip so we could hoist it out. I walked down the floating wooden dock. The water in the marina was dark green and slick, with a thin film of oil. A couple of local kids were fishing off the end of the pier about 50 yards away. They were maybe 10 or 11. They had a bucket of bait and a cheap spinning rod. I grabbed the bowline of the bayliner and wrapped it around the cleat. I was pulling the slack tight when I heard a sharp crack, followed immediately by a heavy splash. I whipped my head around. One of the kids was gone. The railing he had been sitting on had given way. The wood was rotten. My heart seized. It didn't speed up. It just stopped. The air vanished from my lungs. The smell of diesel faded, instantly replaced by the phantom smell of indoor chlorine. I wasn't in Oregon anymore. I was staring at a grainy security video on a stolen hard drive. The other kid on the dock started screaming. I didn't think. I dropped the rope. I sprinted down the floating dock, my heavy work boots pounding against the wood. The dock pitched and rolled under my weight. I reached the broken railing. I looked down into the dark, freezing water. The boy was thrashing. He was tangled in the loose fishing line, panicking, swallowing seawater. He was going under. There was no lifeguard. There was no one on their phone. There was just me. I didn't take my boots off. I didn't empty my pockets. I dove straight in. The cold hit me like a baseball bat to the chest. It punched the breath out of me, shocking my system so hard my vision blurred. The water was heavy. I kicked upward, breaking the surface, gasping for air. I grabbed the boy by the back of his jacket. He fought me. He was wild with terror, his elbows hitting me in the jaw, trying to climb on top of me to get out of the water. We both went under. The green water closed over my head. I saw Lily. I saw her in lane 4. I saw her looking up at the surface, waiting for a hand that never came. I kicked violently, hauling the boy upward. We broke the surface again. I wrapped my arm over his chest, locking him against my side, pinning his arms so he couldn't push us both down. "I got you," I yelled. "Stop fighting. I got you." He went limp, coughing violently, hacking up seawater. Mac was suddenly there, kneeling on the edge of the dock. He reached down with a heavy, calloused hand and grabbed the boy by the collar of his jacket, hauling him out of the water and onto the wood like a caught fish. I swam to the ladder, my clothes weighing 100 pounds. I dragged myself up the algae-slick rungs and collapsed onto the dock next to the kid. We laid there side by side, soaking wet, breathing hard. The kid's friend was crying. Mac was standing over us, holding a boat hook, breathing heavily through his nose. He looked down at me. "You okay? Under the table?" he asked. I nodded slowly. I sat up, peeling my wet jacket off. My jaw ached where the kid had hit me. I looked at the boy. He was shivering, his lips blue, but he was breathing fine. He was alive. "Go home," Mac told the kids gruffly. "Tell your parents to buy you life jackets if you're gonna sit on rotten wood." The boys scrambled up, grabbed their bucket, and ran off down the pier. I stayed on the dock. The adrenaline was draining out of my blood, leaving behind a cold, shaking exhaustion. I looked at the dark water lapping against the pilings. I had gone in. For a decade, I hadn't been able to walk past a hotel pool without my chest tightening, and I had just jumped into the Pacific Ocean wearing work boots. Mac walked back up the dock and returned a minute later with a dry wool blanket and a thermos of black coffee. He dropped the blanket on my shoulders and handed me the cup. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "No," I said. My teeth were chattering. Most people do. He took a sip from the thermos cap. "Lost my brother to the water 30 years ago. Crabbing boat went down off Coos Bay. Coast Guard said he probably froze before he drowned. Took me 5 years to look at the ocean without wanting to shoot it." I looked up at him. He didn't offer any empty platitudes. He didn't tell me time heals all wounds. He just stated a fact. "How did you stop wanting to shoot it?" I asked. Mac looked out at the gray horizon. I realized the ocean wasn't trying to hurt him. It was just being the ocean. You can't be mad at water for being water. He paused. "Or maybe you just get tired of carrying the gun." He turned and walked back to the yard. I went home early that day. I stripped off my wet clothes, took a boiling hot shower, and put on dry sweatpants. I made a fire in the wood stove. I went into the bedroom. The plastic storage bin was still pushed into the corner, exactly where I had left it when I moved in. I dragged it out. I popped the heavy plastic latches. The lid came off with a suction sound. I reached inside and pulled out the nylon swim bag. It felt different in my hands now. It didn't feel like a reliquary. It didn't feel radioactive. I unzipped it. I took out the pink-tinted goggles. I took out the silicone cap. I took out the heavy yellow towel. I laid them out on the wooden floor in front of the fire. They were just objects. They were things my daughter had used. They didn't contain her. Her death was a fact of my life, a scar that ran right down the center of my chest. But the objects weren't the scar. They were just cotton and plastic. I gathered the towel and the bag in my arms. I walked into the small kitchen, opened the washing machine, and dropped them in. I added detergent. I closed the lid and pulled the dial to start the cycle. The machine kicked on. Water rushed in. I stood there and listened to it. I didn't panic. I didn't see red. I just heard the sound of water cleaning something that had been kept in the dark for too long. When the cycle was done, I threw the towel in the dryer. The next morning, I took it out. It was warm and smelled like cheap laundry soap. I folded it in half and hung it on the hook in the bathroom, right next to the shower. I took my work boots out to the porch to dry, poured myself a cup of coffee, and got in my truck to head down to the boatyard. I had a hull to sand.